You are listening to the Ibn Abi Umar podcast. This is your host, Umar Osman. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm excited to be back with a brand new episode. This is one that I have been trying to schedule for a while and have been looking forward to recording for a long time. It is an episode with Sheikh Suleiman Hani from AlMaghrib Institute and Yaqeen Institute. The title of the episode is Destination Setting, and it goes into detail on how we anchor our decision making to the Akhirah. I know that might sound a little obvious at first, but we get into a lot of detail on the importance of the worldview that you adopt, how this idea of destination setting plays into decisions like ethical business and career ambition, daily habits to support the right type of destination setting, and a lot of other really, really good topics. I really enjoyed this discussion. I learned a lot just from listening to it and interviewing Sheikh Suleiman Hani, and inshallah hope that you guys find this of benefit as well. Please make sure that you are subscribed to the email list. I've got a couple of new articles in the pipeline that are coming out very soon. And as always, if you have not yet grabbed your copy of the book Fiqh of Social Media from Amazon, please make sure you do that. If you have read it, a review and rating on Amazon is always appreciated. And with that, we will get into the episode. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. We're joined by Sheikh Suleiman Hani of AlMaghrib Institute and Yaqeen Institute. Sheikh, how are you doing today?
Alhamdulillah, barakallahu feekum, jazakumullah khairan for having me, Umar.
Jazakallah khair. So, Sheikh, I wanted to have you on to, in the broader theme of personal development, faith-based approaches. I'd reached out to you and you'd mentioned something along the lines of destination setting, goal setting, and anchoring with an Akhira perspective, which I thought was a really interesting take on some of these common topics that we hear about a lot. Let me just open it up with that general question of destination setting. Like, what is that? How do you view it? What's the importance of it?
Barakallahu feekum. Bismillah. So the first thing that I'll say is that oftentimes when it comes to decision-making, personal development, the self-help industry, obviously there are a lot of subjective opinions and views about what is most effective and most efficient for all people or for a particular community of people. And the reason I say for a particular community of people is because, for example, from the Islamic perspective, when it comes to looking at destinations, looking at where you want to end up, what goals you're setting, I believe, I do say it's an Islamic perspective, but it's also just from a general philosophical perspective that we must first begin with a worldview, because our worldview impacts pretty much all of our decisions, our lifestyles, what we decide to do. A worldview, for those who don't know, basically is a set of beliefs about how you view the world, a set of beliefs about some very fundamental aspects of reality. And all of these beliefs that you have, and we're not talking here about where they come from, but the beliefs that you do already have, they essentially influence all of your perceiving, your thinking, your analyzing, your knowing, and then your doing, your decisions. So in a way, our goals, our decisions, our lifestyles are shaped by what we believe. And that includes oftentimes things that we are certain about and things we are uncertain about, as well as opinions about maybe random things. And our values in terms of the destination that we seek includes the specific goal, where you want to end up, the objectives that you have, the strategies as well, and then the trade-offs. And all of this really, I know it sounds like a complicated answer to a very simple question of destinations and what does that mean. Before we decide we want to become better or improve or progress towards a certain goal, we all as human beings need to take a step back and reflect frequently on the worldview that we have. Who am I?
Yeah. So I love this idea of worldview, because I think anytime I'm looking at something, even if it's like reading a book, right? You see the worldview of the author and how it's impacting the work. So like you mentioned a couple of things, like for example, decision making or goal setting. If someone is writing from a worldview of, let's say the author is atheist, and they're writing from a secular or, grounded in capitalism perspective, the way that they'll approach a topic like personal development or professional growth, or even what the end destination is, much differently than, let's say, an author. Maybe they're not Muslim, but maybe they're writing with a faith-based perspective in mind. And that also will differ from how a Muslim is approaching it. But maybe let's start here. What would an Islamic worldview be for you? Like, beyond just, yes, we believe in the akhirah, we follow the Quran and Sunnah, but what does an Islamic worldview actually look like in terms of when we're interpreting all this information around us?
Sure. I'll say two things. The first, I really liked your comment on the different approaches. An atheist might write about this in a very different way than a Muslim, and also someone who is attempting to remove their views, their worldview, from their writings in order to make it more secular or appealing to all people. And oftentimes, a mistake could be made, and sometimes it is, and other times it's not made, which is trying to avoid one's worldview in approaching all people or as many people as possible for the sake of profits or impact, whatever it may be, eventually is going to lead to the question of transcendence. Like, what is it that you want? Why do you value that destination, that goal that you have? What is it that you want with your life? And I'll give an example. And I know that this is still responding to the first point, but it is really crucial because it's the foundation of the entire discussion here. A Harvard professor teaching, for example, coaching psychology, is teaching about all the different elements of coaching and coaching psychology and habits, decisions, all of that stuff. And then ultimately it gets to the point where, yes, it looks like it is secular throughout. It's not talking about a particular religion or faith. But it eventually gets to the point where we discuss transcendence as one of the most important elements in the discussion. And so I decided to have a private conversation with this professor. Essentially, this is a 5-6 day intensive course at Harvard. And the conversation really for me was just to hear, at least from this professor who's been teaching coaching psychology for at least 25-30 years, was to hear about her perspective in terms of the role of religion and spirituality and belief in God or belief in divine reality on goal setting, on decision making. And in private, she said that there's a certain way I can teach a course to accommodate as many people as possible who don't believe in God. But in terms of my beliefs and what I found in my studies, in terms of psychology, in terms of helping people, in terms of people's progress, is that belief in God and belief in a divine reality certainly has a positive impact on the way that people live their lives and drives them towards goals that they believe are objective, they're factual rather than arbitrary, that I'm making up my own purpose in life and my own worldview. I'm putting on basically lenses that I've made rather than lenses that were made to see the world. And so this is why I wanted to start with that point, and I appreciate what you said about this. From the Islamic perspective, the worldview essentially is the entirety of the set of, let's say, the pillars of Iman, the pillars of faith, right? To believe in God. And obviously, every one of these pillars has its own detailed study and description for each person. Believe in God, believe in the angels, to believe in life after death, to believe in the prophets and messengers, as well as the scriptures. And then the final scripture that was preserved for all of mankind as a form of guidance. And then, of course, belief, not just in the afterlife, but belief in destination or decree, the easy and the difficult. This essentially is a summary of the Islamic worldview about why we exist and the different pillars of reality.
What you mentioned, the professor talking about in private, the world, how that worldview is, in the context of transcendence. One thing I've noticed with the Muslim audience is we have a specific worldview, but sometimes and I don't mean to bring like religion in the workplace or something, specific situations like that, but in a more general sense, I feel we're sometimes hesitant to share our worldview because it might alienate people. And I think there's something here in terms of sharing the Islamic worldview actually would be beneficial for people. How do you get people to bridge that gap where we're hesitant to share it and maybe not realizing that that's what people may need to hear?
That's a really good question. And the first thing that I'll say is that obviously anyone who hears this should realize that every situation is different, every context is different, and it requires some maybe some thought and some wisdom to how you approach each situation. So there's no one, blanket answer for everything. However, the one misconception that I do want to address that many people have is that there is such thing as neutrality or pure secularism from a philosophical perspective. What I mean by this is that everyone has a worldview. Everyone believes in something. Everyone is looking at the world or perceiving the world in some way, whether or not they're addressing it, or the terminology and the words that they use are maybe sugarcoating it or hiding it or attempting to hide it. It's more subtle at times. But oftentimes we start to hear the same terms over and over and over, or the same type of language or rhetoric that's used, to the extent that some people believe that there is pure neutrality with no worldview taught in, for example, schools or exemplified in workplaces. But the reality is, in most disciplines that are taught at secular schools or public schools and universities and so on and so forth, there is a worldview attached to a lot of what is taught. It's not all, we cannot claim that everything is, let's say, pure mathematics, 1 + 1 = 2. There is a worldview attached to
Almost
what
like
is being taught.
there's always a bias. It's better to just be open and recognize it as opposed to trying to hide it or cover it up.
There's always a bias, number one, and number two, there is no problem. And this is where maybe sometimes Muslims are worried. And of course, there's a lot more to say about that. That's beyond the scope of our discussion. But sometimes Muslims or others are worried about expressing or showing any part of their worldview, thinking that it is somehow going to basically cast them out as different or make them look like they're aggressive or odd or weird. The reality is, we can live as human beings side by side and interact openly and express openly. And we should be able to express openly our worldviews or elements of it with one another without feeling like there's a problem with disagreements with different approaches. And I don't mean here that I am justifying a particular worldview that is wrong. What I'm saying is that expressing it is not a problem. And the problem is when people no longer feel comfortable showing what they believe in a way that's non, hostile or violent or anything like that, while, agreeing to disagree. That as Muslims in the workplace, for example, you find that many of the problems people are discussing and many of the issues people struggle with, whether it's in psychology or business or integrity or efficiency or something as simple as the time that you clock in and the fact that you're accountable as a Muslim for every second that you're being paid, and that you're not taking advantage or abusing any kind of workplace flexibility or policies or supplies or resources, that you are a person of integrity because of your worldview. A lot of the problems people face politically and the arguments people have in a very divided, let's say, American nation for now, and pretty much anywhere around the world, is because of people's worldviews. And oftentimes, if we are not addressing these solutions, and of course, the words that we use may be wise, may be subtle, don't necessarily need to say, well, my Islamic worldview or Islam says this. Oftentimes, you can just say what the solution is, and them knowing that you're a person of integrity, honesty, values, and also a Muslim, with solutions to all of these problems that we face, is its own form of, da'wah, its own form of showing people what is right, what is true, what is correct in all of these different scenarios.
One thing that I find, and this is kind of in line with this idea of, let's say growth and goal setting and all of that, is, and I don't know how prevalent this is, I have anecdotally heard it in conversations with people, but it's the idea that in order to succeed, let's say I have growth goals in my career, or with my business, or something of that nature, progressing in the corporate world, whatever it may be, that an Islamic worldview will hold you back, in the sense that some of the skills that are needed to get ahead, uh, there's elements of things like self-promotion, there's elements of things like stepping up and taking leadership and not deferring to someone else. Whereas maybe if you're working in, let's say, like at the masjid or volunteering, and someone's doing a good job, you would defer and say, alhamdulillah, this brother's doing better than I should step back and let them do it. But in the corporate world, it's almost quite the opposite, where you actually have to push yourself forward. And that sometimes goes against that what we might perceive to be an Islamic worldview.
I really like that you said what we might perceive to be, because oftentimes when these questions come up from community members struggling with different, let's say, corporate issues, oftentimes their perspectives about what is or is not Islamic is not accurate. Like the idea of not, I don't want to say self-promotion, because oftentimes it means very specific things and different things to different people, but the idea that you can't put yourself in a position of leadership or management in the corporate world. And that's not true even outside of the corporate world. There are a lot of misconceptions here. What I would say is, number one, for Muslims in general, is to ensure that your belief about these different, let's say, situational issues is actually Islamic, or is actually reflective of the Islamic perspective. And the reason I say that is because a lot of the problems can be overcome by just making sure and ensuring that it is true, it is accurate, that I can or cannot do such and such from the Islamic worldview. And this includes putting oneself out there for management, making networking, connections, things like that. There are, of course, things that are prohibited. And oftentimes in some spheres, to be very frank, in some types of, I don't want to say industries, but industries and role of society, there are things that Muslims, yes, will not be able to get ahead in, because most of that, let's say, environment is based off of who can, let's say, exemplify certain immoral traits that we disagree with the best. And so because of that, a certain thing may be difficult for a Muslim to progress in. And this can really apply to so many different things that we experience in life. You know, I have friends who, for example, are selling actively on e-commerce websites. And one of the things that they struggle with is a lot of the tactics used by those who are trying to outsell them, their competition, are immoral, unethical things. And they may even be violations of policies of these companies. But these other sellers, for example, will have like fake reviews or bombarding this particular competition with, you know, one-star reviews as an example. So the friend says, what am I supposed to do? Because, you know, as Muslims, we do these things. We have certain, you know, guidelines we follow, and we'll stick to them. But people who are getting ahead with their immorality, with a lack of integrity. And honestly, I recognize the difficulty in that in some scenarios, depending on what it is. But what we value ultimately in terms of the payoff is much greater than what they're getting as a payoff. And it's important to consider that in the decision-making process when you're thinking about what you're doing and why you're doing it, who you're doing it for, and what you want to end up with. You staying honest and a person of integrity is because you believe it to be true and you believe in the payoff. For example, the pleasure of God and eternal paradise. And that's not something you can kind of put a price tag on compared to any worldly payoff. And it will at times, in some scenarios, limit Muslims in terms of progressing in some circles. But in most other areas of society and workplace and education and so on and so forth, it is possible for a Muslim to get ahead, to excel, to promote oneself within a certain context by also reflecting on their own humility, why I'm doing what I'm doing. I'm doing this to, for example, progress in the corporate ladder for the sake of benefiting the community, my family, but also I recognize that any good that I have in me of traits or qualifications, I attribute all good to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not from me. And that's the difference between maybe a secularized approach to confidence in oneself versus the Islamic worldview, which is we humble ourselves towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and recognize our need for him and for his blessings, that there are people who work harder than every CEO in this world, and yet those people don't have a fraction of material wealth. So that's not necessarily its own, let's say, factor for being successful. And it's important to attribute good in general to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and recognize our, you know, fragility, our weaknesses, so that we remain humble while we are in a strategic way, in a corporate environment, leading because we believe we are qualified, or putting ourselves ahead because we believe we'll make things better. And as a result of making things better from the Islamic perspective, it betters, let's say, society or our communities or our families.
Yeah, I was gonna say, you know, when you mentioned the example about like the e-commerce, some of that stuff, it's challenging because that's how the game is played. But in a sense, there's clear boundaries in terms of, you know, what we can or can't do, right? Like we would know, for example, giving someone fake 1-star reviews would be lying. And like, even anyone knows lying is wrong, right? That's not like a very clear boundary. I think the struggle sometimes is the areas where maybe the values are less clear. And so, like a lot of what you were talking about in terms of attributing success to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and so on, the biggest challenge that I've noticed is narcissism, in varying degrees. Just because it does tend to get rewarded. And because it sometimes gets rewarded, people feel that they also need to emulate it. But that it almost feels like a bigger trap because the boundaries aren't as clear cut.
That's very true. And I would say when someone is in such a situation, just ask. Like ask about your particular situation, ask someone of knowledge that you trust, to ensure that the way that you are, I don't want to say playing the game, but in a way you are playing a game when you're in different political environments, whether it's a workplace or a masjid or anything else. But ask about the situation that you feel to be a gray area and get guidance, 2, 3 opinions on something that really is not, it doesn't seem clear cut. But I would say that not everything that people chase after in this world, even if they're being rewarded for it in a material way, is good. We already know this in terms of our worldview. So there are going to be limitations and boundaries. What they are will vary from person to person and context to context. So I would just advise the one who is looking for answers and clarity to make sure that what they're doing is permissible and it's not affecting their faith negatively, and it's not going to cost them anything in terms of the afterlife or their pursuit of the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
So I think that's a good segue to now this idea of destination setting. So we've talked about the worldview, we've talked a little bit about values. How should that drive this idea of destination setting and what we're working toward?
Excellent. Jazakallah khairan. So one way to begin, and this is obviously from the Islamic worldview, one of my favorite ways to begin, and eventually I feel that this is worthy of publishing a book on the topic, inshallah ta'ala, and I am teaching this in numerous classes, is starting off with a hadith. And the first time I heard this prophetic narration, I really was, obviously when we read random hadith here and there, some hit us more than others, some impact us more than others. When I read this hadith in particular, I paused and I just started thinking about it and how real the potentiality is. And I'll share what the hadith is so that there's no more anticipation, inshallah. The translation of which is that the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace be upon him, said, "There is no one amongst you who does not have 2 positions, one in paradise and one in the hellfire. The believer will have a house built for him in paradise, and his house in the hellfire will be demolished." The understanding of scholars based on this hadith is that all people, all basically the children of Adam alayhi salam, have already 2 positions, meaning 2 possibilities in terms of destinations, one in paradise and one in the hellfire. When the believers enter paradise, the position that was, let's say, had their name on it in hellfire is demolished or removed. And the disbeliever who is not eventually going to basically enter paradise, such a person, because they're not going to enter paradise, will have their position in paradise demolished when they enter the hellfire. So the places of Jannah, paradise, are only for the people of paradise, and the places of the hellfire are essentially only for the people of the hellfire. The frightening reality of this hadith is that because we start off with the worldview of knowing what we believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we believe in life after death, we believe in paradise and hellfire, and these are realities that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala already created. This hadith demonstrates the potential for all people to enter paradise or hellfire. And the initial emotional response to this should include some element of fear that if my decisions are certain types of decisions, then the position in the hellfire that has my name on it might manifest as a reality. And if I don't ensure that I'm reflecting on my decisions in the right way, in a correct way, then eventually, the position in paradise will be missed out on. But if I do take care of that, then the position of paradise will be manifested in reality. And I know there's a lot more to say about this hadith. In fact, the entire discussion could really circulate around this one hadith. But the point I want to make is we begin with the 2 possible destinations in mind, not one. One being obviously the one that we want, the one that we desire, and that's paradise, and the alternative possibility and the only other option, which is the hellfire, and that's the destination that we seek to avoid. This is the foundation, essentially, of the like the link between destinations and decisions that I want to start with. I'm curious about your thoughts about this hadith, Omar.
So the question that came to mind, so you mentioned decisions that we make, and I think there's an obvious understanding in terms of how I decide to spend my money. It can be, has a direct link to this hadith. My question for you would be, what about other decisions, especially in the context of, let's say, goal setting and professional growth, that may not be clear? So for example, if I'm deciding between getting an MBA or a master's in finance, for example, right? Something where I'm trying, it's in my life, it seems like a very huge decision, like what should I go to grad school for example. But ultimately, I don't see either of these affecting my akhirah in a sense. Now, like, I understand I should have an Islamic worldview on everything. How do I tie that ultimate destination to decisions like this, which they're not inconsequential, but at the same time, I don't see how they line up?
Excellent. That's an excellent question. And that's exactly what I hope to link for people in several seminars that I teach and online and offline. It is what people perceive to be a gap between, or a severe disconnect between our decisions in this world, what seems to be purely for ad-dunya, and our beliefs in the destinations that do exist. And this is why I wanted to start with the, I guess, the bigger picture here, the worldview, right? So you start with the two positions. Both of these are a reality. The question is, for you to make it to paradise, what needs to happen in this world? So there's, I guess, the micro and the macro here. If you're thinking about paradise and you say, that is what I desire, this is the destination that I seek. And there's the question of why. Why is this so valuable to you? Why is this so important to you? What is its description? How does it motivate you? These are important questions and daily reflections that we take from different sources, like prayer. When we're asking for paradise, we're asking for forgiveness, we're asking for protection against the fire. These are also things we take from our daily recitation, hopefully daily recitation of the Qur'an, that we're seeing constant reminders about these two destinations and the general destination of the afterlife, that we were not created for this world or to remain in this world. Now, the question on a practical level in terms of everyday life is, how then do we link our goals and our decisions and our decision-making process to what we desire of the ultimate destination? I would say, when you have your ultimate destination in mind and you're thinking about, let's say, a very summarized, I am really summarizing a much longer discussion, possibly 12 to 14 hours of seminar discussions into just a few minutes here. If you're taking your final destination of paradise and your life mission statement, I exist because, or my life mission is such and such, to worship God, to make it to paradise. Simplified. I know there's a lot more detail, but this is the most important thing you want to take from your life before you start talking about your career, your education, your relationship, your children. If you could only take one thing from your existence before you die, it's going to depend on your worldview. But as a Muslim, it's going to be that I want to fulfill the purpose of life, to worship God, to make it to paradise. And to worship God means certain things in terms of rituals, prayer, fasting, all of that. And then in terms of how I live my life. This is where a lot of people think there is, or feel that there is a disconnect between what they're doing and what they believe to be, let's say, a few rituals that are decisions that they're actively making that lead to paradise. With career, education, work, all of that, a person should reflect on, let's say, for example, the goals that I have in these different realms or different spheres of life, education, health, relationships, everything but rituals, but ibadat, because that's its own thing that we should be developing. How do I link these to my purpose in life, to the destination that I seek? And so if I'm working, the question is, first of all, before what job am I pursuing or what career do I want? Why am I working? What is the point of all of this? And a lot of people, yes, are asking, what is the point of work in general? And oftentimes in today's, I guess, today's discussions and dialogue, a lot of people are very nihilistic, right? And obviously many of them may be atheist or agnostic or just non-practicing Christians or even possibly Muslims, but people seeing work as a mundane task that they absolutely hate. From the Islamic perspective, the question of why and how is this linked to paradise is a really important question, because you start to realize that your work is not, it's not purely for the sake of, let's say, making money. It's not for just an income or a livelihood. Because if you stop there and you don't link your livelihood to your existence, then something is missing internally. And also a conscious decision is then being missed out on, which is the point of livelihood, the point of survival in general is to take care of my family, my community, other people. Let's say the work that you do in particular, let's say it has some kind of impact on society, or it's doing something very particular, or whatever it may be, you're doing something to advance something for society, to benefit people, to provide a resource that people need. So I am working for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and I am doing, let's say, XYZ, whatever the job is. Yes, for multiple reasons. One of them is for a livelihood, and that income that I'm receiving is not just for the sake of pleasure or desires or for my own fulfillment. It's for the sake of benefiting society, contributing to society, being able to give in charity, being a giving hand rather than just a receiving hand. And that's an advice from the Prophet ﷺ. When we start thinking of all the reasons that our work is linked to paradise, the final destination that we seek, perhaps we'll have a more conscious decision-making process in even choosing the job that we're pursuing. And in fact, this is exactly what we've heard from community members when we've talked about linking your decisions here to your destination there. Because, for example, a community member who was in a small dilemma, if you will, trying to choose between two different careers, two different offers that he had, both very lucrative. And he said one of them seemed a little better financially, but a lot worse spiritually, meaning I couldn't find a really good link between that job and my purpose in life and paradise and everything else. So he said, I actually opted for the other job, but I'm much happier. I'm really happy with what I'm doing because I feel like it is linked consciously to why I exist and the purpose for working to begin with. So this is one example of linking something that seems to be worldly to our destination. And what happens is every second you're working and studying for that job ends up also becoming a conscious act of worship. So you're rewarded for it by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's also more, number two, more barakah in it. There's blessings in what you do because you're doing it for the sake of Allah. You're not doing it for a kind of secular worldly thing. You're doing this for something greater. And number three, most people find that, and this is anecdotal, but I'm sure there are studies on this, most people who link their jobs and their studies to something transcendent beyond the material tend to be happier, that it's more meaningful. And they tend to be able to get through the difficult and mundane parts of work or studies because it's not ending there, rather it's linked to something greater.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you mentioned that part about getting through something mundane. I've noticed the same thing, which is unless people have, and like I work in the corporate world, you encounter all types of people. Unless people have some personal tie to something transcendent, it's very difficult for them to get through, even when things are hard at work, right? Like that idea of being able to persist through, make it out to the other side, and so on. If they don't have some sort of transcendent belief, else the failure rate is actually much higher.
Yeah, subhanAllah, that's so true. And especially these days, as people get more and more comfortable and in fact, especially in terms of being timely, especially during this pandemic, we find that a lot of people are rethinking their decisions. A lot of people had time to reflect. A lot of people are, with a shortage in staffing all around the world and in the US as well. A lot of people are rethinking their decisions in terms of where they're living, why they're working that way, why they're commuting an hour and a half, 2 hours every day for a job that they don't even enjoy. A lot of people are reflecting on the sacrifices that they're making by working and not seeing family. People are obviously discussing work from home and now demanding it, and many companies are trying to accommodate that. So it's interesting to see where the worldview comes in here. And when people really reflect on what they believe in and what matters to them beyond the material, it tends to lead to better decisions in terms of the types of jobs that they take and how meaningful they find their jobs to begin with. And in fact, I would encourage those who are able to and those who have some choice, inshallah ta'ala, to try to pursue jobs that are more meaningful, that are more linked to or strongly linked to your ultimate destination. But this doesn't mean that taking on a mundane job is a problem, because still you're doing it as an act of worship. Your goal, your motivation is beyond just, hey, I'm doing this for an income. Your income has its own goals that are linked to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, linked to your purpose in life. And this is important, obviously, even before that in education. This is important in terms of relationships. When people are getting married or people are choosing their companionship, their friends, people are choosing their educational pathways. They're looking at first, again, the worldview, the final destination that is possible of paradise or hellfire. And if you're choosing paradise and you're really motivated and you're really eager to make it there because of its value, because of how amazing it is in ways we cannot really describe, then make sure that your decisions here towards the career, the education, are going to bring you closer to that in some way. Don't cut it off, because some people think, well, I have a question. From the Islamic perspective, it's possible for something to be mubah, like permissible, but it's not rewarding and it's not sinful. It's just purely worldly in a way. And there's no conscious decision that my education or my work are for a spiritual or transcendent reason. Is that permissible? Yes, but what is the problem with that? If you are someone who you believe yourself to be ambitious and you believe yourself to be taking every wise and reasonable decision to make it to paradise as a final destination, then you have here an opportunity cost. By not intending your education and your entirety of your work and your career life, any kind of work that you do, by not intending that for the sake of Allah and not tying that to paradise, you're missing out on massive possible rewards, opportunities, barakah, blessings, and obviously the tranquility and the happiness that comes with that. So yes, there are major decisions in life that we make that should be directly tied into paradise. And I urge people to take a step back and reflect before making major decisions on how this is linked to paradise, why that's so important, why this is so valuable for you. And inshallah ta'ala, that list that you make, I know this sounds very practical and maybe simplistic, but a list of motivators, the question of why, is really powerful when you're struggling, when things are mundane. Go back to that list. And when you're feeling things are difficult, go back to the list and reflect more on it, why you started this to begin with, and where you are today, and what needs to change for you to improve that tomorrow. And then you have the minor decisions. And it's said by some, I don't know if this is accurate, by some researchers, that we make more than 30,000 decisions a day. Obviously, most of these are subconscious and constantly happening. For example, I'm making constant decisions right now in speaking with you, Omar, and you're making constant decisions,
Right.
in speaking back. So yes, there are a lot of decisions that we make that are subconscious and some less significant than others. But the point is that when we, I don't want to say train ourselves, but discipline ourselves and tie in our habits, these subconscious habits, to that final destination of paradise by referencing it, by thinking about it, by praying for it, by studying it as well, and ensuring that our goals are tied, major and minor, to the worldview, we tend to be making, let's say, 30,000 good decisions rather than missing out on all of these opportunities, like somebody zoning out in a Friday khutbah because although it's 15 minutes, it's short, it's great, let's say a great speaker and all of that, eloquent, very beneficial, but the person just zoning out because internally they're struggling to link, let's say, their lives and their experiences to something greater, something transcendent, as an example.
So I'm curious, no one would ever willingly come and say, I'm anchoring my decisions to the hellfire, right? Like that, would not be something a normal person ever said. But what I'm curious about though, have you come across any situations where someone is maybe rationalizing to themselves or even outwardly saying, I'm doing this with the goal of paradise, but it's in actuality behavior that would be anchored to the hellfire?
That's a great question. And oftentimes, what we see, and this is actually an explicit point that I make in some of the classes that I teach, which is that if you're constantly linking everything to paradise, your habits as well, and then you run into an action you cannot intend for the sake of Allah, like you cannot really tie it into paradise, this does not bring you closer to that destination, then pause and reflect on the action because there's something problematic with it. And of course, you have some people who know that what they're doing is wrong, that it's anchored into the hellfire, let's say. And then you have people who try to justify a wrongdoing. And these are two different things. One is maybe lazy, one is exhausted, one is missing something in their connection with Allah, not enough motivation, not enough hope, not enough fear, for example. And then the other is, and this is much more dangerous, the other is prideful. And that's actually one of the definitions of kibir, arrogance or pride from the Islamic worldview, is that a person receives the truth and then they reject it. So they try to justify what they're doing. And of course, that's exactly what the devil did when he was reprimanded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Instead of accepting responsibility for his actions, he blamed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Bima aghwaytani. Basically, you made me do this. Why? Why is he blaming God? He's like, because you created Adam alayhi salam, and you told me to prostrate to him. And then Adam and Hawa, when they were reprimanded, they repented to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They acknowledged what they did. They asked Allah for forgiveness, and then they moved on. رَبَّنَا ظَلَمْنَا أَنفُسَنَا. Our Lord, we wronged ourselves. وَإِن لَمْ تَغْفِرْ لَنَا وَتَرْحَمْنَا لَنَكُونَنَّ مِنَ الْخَاسِرِينَ. They recognize the reality that if you don't forgive us and have mercy on us, we will surely be amongst the losers. So yes, there are people who try to justify their actions, and they think that what they're doing is right. And that's actually one of the most frightening things in this world, for a person to be so steeped in their arrogance that they refuse to see that they're wrong. They refuse to take advice. They refuse to reconsider their action. When generally speaking, in terms of Islam, the moral and immoral are known to most people at the general basic level. And so somebody who's sincere and willing to be corrected and to basically acknowledge what they're doing is wrong will do that. But the problem is what it goes back to the worldview. Like I know this sounds like a tangent here, but an example that a lot of people are struggling with in America today is that much of their worldview may be influenced by what they think is secular or completely cut off from religion, but in fact it is a worldview. Belief systems based on, let's say, social movements or social justice causes or progressives or liberals or conservatives. These are all words that mean many things to different people. So don't get hung up on the words, but ultimately they're taking their beliefs about what is right or wrong, or what rights each person should have or should not have, or how we should govern societies. And they're being impacted by these worldviews. And it's, in a way, it's like a lens that you're wearing. It's no longer based on, let's say, Islam. So now they're looking into Islam and they're looking through that lens of whatever belief that they took. So it starts to become confusing to them. Why is this in Islam? How is that right? I don't agree with that. We should change this and that.
Yeah,
And
I was
what's
gonna say one of our
yeah,
biggest challenges is that people have a worldview without realizing that they have one. It's almost
yeah,
like the culture of the society affects you, but I don't think people realize to what extent.
100%. SubhanAllah. And that's why oftentimes when Muslims are struggling with the different elements of faith, we remind them, recognize what is wrong first so that you can work on it. But the problem is, if you don't even believe as a worldview, if you don't believe what you're doing is wrong, there's a greater problem. There's a greater risk here, because then you're making a decision based on a worldview where you're expecting an outcome like paradise. But paradise has criteria that we know about. So the one who created paradise, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, also told us about the criteria of success, what it means to be successful, and the details, and sometimes the general boundaries, the details and the boundaries of morality that's objective. So for a person to then come with a different worldview and try to modify parts of it, whether due to desires or emotions or anger or arrogance, pride, reasoning, or just being misled by other belief systems, they're expecting paradise with a different set of criteria, with a different set of conditions. And that's problematic in decision making, because you have to know your destination, you have to know the outcome, you have to know the criteria and the conditions that are required to make it there. And then you have like the payoff table, you have basically all the possibilities in terms of what might happen along the way. But ultimately, we're all looking for that. In a way, we're looking for the largest payoff. And sometimes that doesn't come through rationalizing, because what's reasonable is more obvious, working for paradise. Sometimes emotions and internal spiritual, let's say, issues or defective traits may overcome us. May Allah protect us all.
Sheikh, one thing that you mentioned earlier was, having the discipline around your daily decisions. I think for a lot of people, let's just say for me, right, I might say like, okay, intellectually, yes, have a desire to anchor my decision making to paradise, for example. But in the execution of it on a day-to-day basis, I might not be as cognizant of that as maybe is required for me to actually attain it. What would your advice be for someone to build that muscle of, increasing the discipline of keeping the akhirah in mind with a lot of those mundane decisions that, again, they just tend to go into the background. We don't think about it, but having that fresh intention on them is so important.
Excellent question, subhanAllah. This is one of the most important questions that really brings to our daily realities and our practical lives, the implementation of what we're discussing here. There are a lot of different things to list. Amongst them is notice how, as human beings, we are in need of constant reminders, right? And this sounds like a very commonsensical statement, but what I mean by this is, even from the Islamic perspective, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds us of this, we are in need of reminders. وَذَكِّرْ فَإِنَّ الذِّكْرَى تَنْفَعُ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. Remind, meaning remind one another, remind people, for verily the reminders benefit the believers. This is why, for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us about certain concepts, not once or twice, but sometimes hundreds of times in the Qur'an. Paradise and hellfire, for example, are not listed. They could have been listed or, referenced in just one place in the Quran in all details, and that's it. But there's a reason that the concepts that help us in terms of the worldview, the motivation, the desires, the emotional parts are in a way interweaved. I don't like to use that word, but throughout the Quran, from beginning to end. So the one who is regularly, for example, reading the Quran and they have a daily habit is constantly being reminded about the things that they need to do and the adjustments that they need to make. So you're being reminded, why do I exist? What do I need to do? This is like someone who says, like on a particular day, I was struggling with something, let's say at work, or to care about my job or my family or relationship or my faith. And then there's this verse that I recited that I never thought about in this way. And it hit home for me on this day because I'm constantly reciting the Quran. So if you're reciting, for example, with a daily Quran habit or a wird in the Arabic language, then you will likely be reminded constantly about the ultimate destination that you seek so that you can correct something in the moment. So the Quran is one. The second is the general pursuit of knowledge. It's not just a reminder. It'll help us in terms of our worldview to better understand and to better be motivated towards paradise. And as a result of that beneficial knowledge that we should be seeking, it impacts basically everything we do and everything we partake in, education, interaction, society, relationships, work. The third is, interestingly, one that it's very basic, subhanAllah, but psychologically makes a world of a difference, is constant dhikr and adhkar. So the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There are different types of remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here on the tongue. One type is in specific instances, there are certain dua, certain supplications we should be making. When you leave your house and you say, Bismillah tawakkaltu ala Allah, when you leave your house and you say, in the name of Allah, now you have barakah, now you have blessings. As long as you're outside the house, you're protected by Allah, you're putting your trust in Allah. And the hadith goes on, and you're protected in many different ways. Think of the impact of these different adhkar, the authentic supplications that you make in the morning or evening. There's morning supplications, there are evening supplications. There is no way in the world someone considers himself or herself to be a productive, engaged, connected Muslim, and they're really aiming high, but they're not taking on the simple habit of the morning and evening supplications. And you can find all these authentic supplications in a number of authentic books like Fortress of the Muslim. I really do recommend this. You can find Hisn Muslim also on apps and online. So I recommend that people who are really trying to connect their afterlife with the dunya in terms of what they're doing, to also be engaged in these adhkar. Why? Because when you make dhikr, when you remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in that dua that you just made, entering your workplace, starting your day at work, starting your day raising your family, starting your day in general, you woke up and you didn't just go to your phone and start checking social media or do something random. You woke up and started with remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Alhamdulillah alladhi ahyana. Praise be to the one who gave us life after death, and to him is our return, meaning there is an afterlife, there is a destination. So my point here, this third point I know is a little long, but when you learn these different supplications for different contexts, you're essentially going to be reminded of your purpose and the final destination throughout your day, because there's so many dua and supplications for all types of scenarios, from morning to night, and including that last moment right before you sleep and the moment you wake up. And the fourth and last point I'll make for now, and again, there are many others, but for the sake of time, is the dhikr that I mentioned that's not necessarily tied into or anchored with, because oftentimes an anchor habit is something that's, will help you connect many different things together, and it will keep you grounded. But the dhikr, the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's specific to asking for paradise. And in fact, we have a number of authentic hadith in which the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace be upon him, tells us that when a person asks Allah for Jannah, for example, in one hadith, 7 times, "Oh Allah, I ask you for Jannah, Allahumma yas'aluka al-Jannah," then paradise makes a dua, prays for you, and says, "Oh Allah, so and so asked you for paradise, so grant him or her paradise." By making this dua, you're not just thinking, "Oh, paradise is praying for me too," and that's something significant. One of the psychological consequences of this dua, if you make it regularly, and it doesn't have to be 7 times or 3 times. When you're making this dua regularly, Allahumma yas'aluka al-Jannah wa a'udhu bika min nar, "Oh Allah, I ask you for paradise and I seek your protection from the fire," is that you are remembering the 2 possible destinations constantly. And if you're making this dua at work, at the school place, while you're driving, waiting, between Zoom calls, whatever it may be, you're making a dua that reminds you of why you exist and where you could end up. And if it is that destination of paradise that you seek, then adjust the actions now that you're a part of. So in other words, all of the examples that I gave are ways for us to be reminded of that final destination in everyday life, that you are referencing Allah constantly. You're connecting your prayers, your 5 prayers, which is why we exist, your 5 prayers afterwards. You have habits that are tied to them, right? You're reciting Ayatul Kursi, you're making dua. So because your daily life is really about the afterlife, and you're also going to work and remembering Allah, you're being reminded in between the ritual acts of worship of why you exist. So listen to the Quran regularly, listen to lectures, make sure that you're asking for Jannah and so on and so forth. If you recite the Quran every day, you're likely to be reminded of that destination, and Allah knows best.
Inshallah. Jazakallah khair. I think that's a really good point to close on, inshallah. Any final thoughts or advice on this topic that you wanted to share?
Jazakumullah khair. And the only thing that I'll say is for us, inshallah ta'ala, to remember basically the conclusion is, if paradise is the final destination that you seek, then ensure that your decisions today reflect that. In other words, if you seek paradise as a final destination with all of its descriptions, and you should study its descriptions and hear about it because it motivates it. Actually, according to a number of studies, that would motivate people to pursue it without even seeing it, subhanAllah. Then act and decide wisely today. And oftentimes it's not that complicated. A person knows in the moment when they hear that reminder what they need to do differently, right? So you're making choices either proactively and consciously for paradise, or choices through elimination. You don't want hellfire. You don't want anything that brings you close to it. So don't play with fire. Don't make that decision that will mess around with your relationship or people or your job or finances that you know is leading down the path that eventually leads to the hellfire. May Allah protect us all. Remember that ultimately planning and dreaming and talking about it or listening to a podcast, all of that is one element. And then the second is taking action. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Qur'an, الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ, those who believe, so you have a worldview, and they do good deeds. They pursue the deeds that lead to the end result. And these are tied together, combined in the Quran more than 50 times. And I looked into this because it was so interesting to me that a lot of times people today say they just want to be spiritual. They just want to believe. They're trying to take the spiritual benefits here in this world, but they don't realize that their decisions have to encompass actions and will include, more importantly, an eternal afterlife. Decide wisely, decide wisely, decide wisely if paradise is the destination that you seek. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us all wise decisions, good actions, and protect us from harm in this life and the next, and grant us the destination of paradise. Allahumma ameen.
Jazakallah khair, Sheikh. Last thing, anywhere that people can connect with you or follow your work online that you'd like to share?
Sure, barakallahu feekum. I mean, I'm active on most social media platforms, Instagram, Facebook, my website as well. Alhamdulillah, a number of people have reached out through there, imamsuleiman.com. But ultimately, anywhere a person finds me online, inshallah ta'ala, lectures and programs will likely be posted there. So Suleiman Hani on Instagram is one place to start, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you'd like to support the podcast, please subscribe in Apple Podcasts or Google Play or whatever podcast player you use. And please rate and review the podcast. As always, if you share it with a friend, that's much appreciated. You can check the show notes for all the details and links. See you in the next episode.